Merry meet Annie here. I think I've got a long one for you folks. Even for me, I think it's going to be a long one. And I'm not known for my short videos, am I? Again, as most of my videos are going to be going forward here from a viewer, so I encourage you to give me a topic or ask me a question. Anything that crosses your mind. I promise that I'm going to get to everything, even if I don't have, is it possible, a lot to say about something. This was a very interesting one for me. I was actually even hesitant to do it, and I'll talk about that as part of this. Here is the question from the viewer, with the suggestion, I should say. I'd love to hear your ideas comparing what public knowledge you can share, comparing your former traditions, traditions, with the assembly of the sacred wheel. For those who don't know what our viewer is referring to, I mentioned in an earlier video that I had become part of the assembly of the sacred wheel, which has its motherstead an hour or so north of where I live. The assembly is a beautifully organized Wiccan tradition of bright, loving, and creative people. More formally from their website, they explain themselves as, the form of Wicca that the assembly practices is syncretic and draws inspiration from astrology, Kabbalah, the Western magical tradition, and the folk religions of Europe. Keepers of the Holy Chalice, the founding coven of the assembly, began its life in February of 1984. The assembly was incorporated in the state of Delaware and granted FO1C status by the IRS in 1995. That's their words that describe them when you first visit their website. The assembly currently consists of 14 covens, and I have the honor to be affiliated with the most recent of those covens. There's more people than that might indicate, though, because covens aren't limited to 14, and there are hundreds of folks who are aligned to the assembly who are not part of an individual coven. While time and my health, my coven is an hour and a half north of here, have required that I withdraw from active participation in my coven, I remain aligned to it and to the assembly. Can you tell by my smile that that's a good thing? I can attend gatherings and classes, and many rituals are open for me to attend. The assembly is blessed with wise and inspirational teachers. Elders in the assembly, Ivo Dominguez and Michael Smith, speak a lot at conventions and gatherings, and some of you may have met them along the way. And there are enough words to describe the beauty and the wisdom of these men, as well as others who are elders in our tradition. Before I get into similarities and differences, I have to say that the assembly is a true and honorable Wiccan tradition. Ethics are high, and passion is fully engaged. There is vitality and variety, a combination of comfort and challenge that I think is the watermark of a true spiritual community. I was at first uncomfortable thinking of what I might share, as I worried it would look as if, I were judging anything different from my past experiences as dubious. But I offer to the universe, and to all of you, that the gods are alive and magic is afoot within the assembly of the sacred wheel, and I apologize, Leonard Cohen, for slightly changing your words. The assembly is a mighty contemporary tradition worth the consideration of any seeker. I say that with no reservations. I've gone into this topic at great length because none of the things I list become deal breakers for me when I decided if the assembly was a good fit for me. I think there's a solid list within all of this of the foundations of practice and where we might check some boxes if any of us are exploring a new coven or group. We can be so eager for community that we try to force fit ourselves into one. Has that happened to you? It has happened to me in the past. I'd suggest that if you are looking for a group, consider your thoughts on each of the things that I mentioned. I'll put a list of them in the text box below. Are there any areas where you couldn't compromise or be flexible? Are there any areas where you're willing to give something new a try? Where do your core beliefs meld with or bump up against the group you're investigating. There's probably a whole other topic out there, and this video could be shorter if I'd split them in two, but you're going to have to bear with me. This is where things went when I wrote about this. So, similarities between my prior experiences in traditional and more casual celebrations of pagan spirituality. As with every coven I've been a part of, there have been differences and similarities, but the core of them all has been a place that, well, feels like home. A place where the old gods are honored and workings are done to the betterment of the individual, the community, and the world. This is where the greatest similarity is between covening and activities within the assembly and all of my past experiences. So here's some of the individual areas where I saw powerful similarities. Honoring of the god and goddess in sacred partnership. I find in the assembly there's no overt focus, one over the other, but there's a true relationship to duality, polarity, and the male and female aspects of divinity. You'd think that would be common, wouldn't you? But I found it often is not. I need perfect balance when it comes to my practice. And that includes the balanced partnership of the god and the goddess. Regarding flow of ritual, there's a general flow of the rite which is common amongst most assembly practitioners. Well, it might be far simpler, say, than the experiences I had in a BTW coven, and which I still follow personally, by the way. There are bones there that come from the same sources and they feel familiar. It's actually kind of comfy and home-like. The elements. The elements are powerfully present and called upon as part of ritual and workings within the assembly. There's shadings of differences from my previous circles, but the same energy shows up, or shall I say that the elements and guardians as I know them show up. The differences might be in the naming of the quarters and the manner in which they are called, but it's a matter of style and energy, and this is not a negative reflection on shadings of difference. It's just a different way of doing some things. An added layer of experience of the elements within the assembly is the use of tattvas. Well, I had familiarity with them. They were not part of my previous practices in circle. And while I honor them comfortably in assembly rituals, they aren't making their way into my private practice as relevant. Probably because the same energy called upon through the tattvas is already present to me in the way that I honor the elegant, in the way I honor the elements. I don't need to add another layer of imagery and history, but I'm way cool with it in assembly ritual. I see the tattvas, I feel the tattvas, I know what they mean. I'm still not quite sure about the relationship to the watchtowers as part of assembly practice. Maybe because it's such a hub, a central thing around which my practice revolves. Maybe that's why really understanding deeply and truly the perspective from the assembly has been one of the few challenging things for me. At times it seems similar to my practice, this relationship to the watchtowers. Other times it seems different. It's not good or bad, just a bit different from my own experience, and I have no problems with it when I'm in assembly circles. Regarding individuality and individual practice, this is actually a big one for me. One of the things that would be a deal breaker if I wasn't feeling at one with the assembly's takes on this. There is whatever we each contribute to circle, and there's what we do privately. And the assembly makes no inroads into private practice. Well, with one exception, I'll get to that in a second. There's an assumption that we're each on an individual journey as well as a communal one. You might think, well, yeah, but I've visited groups over the years, groups I considered being part of, and that was a big red flag for me when it's like, here's what you believe, here's what you do, not just in this circle, but everywhere else. Well, I follow an experiential path, and you're not going to tell me where my personal path is going to take me. I'm the only one that controls that. I'm the only one that influences it. I'm the only one that manifests it. So about this one exception, and gosh, guys, I'm going to talk about this, but if it were a big deal, my dears, I wouldn't be a member of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. But it's the kind of thing that you might want to consider when you are exploring if a group's a good fit for you. Members of the Assembly must swear to do no harm in all of their workings, in the coven, publicly, or privately. This is something which required me to go deep and consider if that's an oath I would willingly take. Does that seem odd to you, considering you know how traditional my take on Wicca is? Well, let me explain it just a bit. In my past circles, that oath was left up to the individual to make with their gods and as an expression of their own free will. Make that free will with the capital W. Will is aligned to our higher purpose and what our gods hold us to. Do I work harm personally? Very rarely. Can't say I never have, but I'm 66 and there's been only a couple of times that is where my workings took me. My life experiences have taught me there are other ways to accomplish the same end, and just as effectively. Even if the first instinct is reactive and possibly to harm, backing off and reconsidering, using the imagination that every one of us as witch should have, there are other ways to accomplish. It was just different for me to have an organization require an oath regarding, or that included, my private practice. I get the importance of adhering to what is expected when I'm with the Assembly. We have to protect the best interests of the wider organization, its relationship to its gods, and its public reputation. But I've not had to promise anyone anything before about my personal practice. That said, I willingly took the oath and I will honor it as long as I am aligned to the Assembly. But it really gave me consideration to stop, pause, and consider. Kabbalah. Kabbalah has not in any way been part of any of my previous covens. Oh, we knew it at a simplistic level, but it was not part of our study or greater focus, and it was not part of our rituals. In my time with the Assembly, I've been guided in person and through their suggestions for literary sources to study the Kabbalah. Actually, it's necessary. It's a part of Assembly rituals and the Wheel of the Year. I only wish this had happened earlier in my life, even though, as I say this, I consider, well, I probably wasn't ready for it earlier in my life. It came along just at the right time, I guess. A place when I could fully benefit from it. Assembly covens choose to align to specific Kabbalic spheres as part of their creation and birthing from their parent coven. Working through that lens is a very important part of Assembly practice and work. This has been an exciting, transformative, new journey for me. Astrology. Astrology was more or less optional in my previous circles. It was taught generally, and then those who felt called to it became experts on behalf of the circle. I'm one who studied it at a more casual level. It just didn't yell out my name. The Assembly covens explore it in great depth and practice in alignment with it. This one I had a hard time deciding what to call the topic. I've settled on working in the head, working here. I would have to say that in light of the Assembly's focus on things like Kabbalah, astrology, and the tarot, there's a lot more being done in the head than in my previous circles. It's more esoteric in feel, even though the rituals are actually much simpler than what I've done previously. Let's just say there's a lot you need to understand at a level beyond the novice. Years ago, I met with a priest and priestess from the Assembly to explore aligning with their coven. They were wonderful people. It was an enjoyable experience to spend time with them. But 3/4 of what they said went right over my head. My past circles, including the traditional circle, which was my home in the 70s, were more about the experience, the sense of being and doing. It was not so much about any collection of information on esoteric and occult practices. This is not a criticism. There's wisdom and power in those old ways. Well, in all old ways, whether they're primal or esoteric in nature. Circle casting. I find similarity in circle casting within the assembly to my experience of traditional Gardnerian and Alexandrian circles. But additionally, there are forms of casting that are unique to the assembly. They're not secret. Ivo published a great book called Casting Sacred Space, which I believe is back in print. It was interesting for me to explore these variations on casting. That's how it felt to me. And I've tried some new things in light of that. Some I've added to the depth of my practice, and some, well, they haven't been as relevant to me. Coven gods. Each coven within the assembly has their own circle gods, but there's not a specific set of deities for the wider assembly. Now, mind you, folks, I'm saying this in the perspective of someone who has been aligned to the assembly for a year and is not an initiate. So, there could be limitations to my knowledge. I'm just speaking from what I see at my level. I'm back after a death of battery situation. You may have realized somewhere along the way I moved from what's similar to what, well, might be in some ways different. I'm sure you picked up on that. Here's one. Chanting. There's a lot of chanting in assembly rites. I'm really not into chants. My history is, when it comes to chanting, well, it's the Ioavohe and nothing else, and it's used once with specific intent within each ritual. I appreciate chanting as a way to be of one voice and one mind, and as a way to raise energy, and even as a way to honor the gods. But I'm not really fond of it showing up more than once in a ritual. I kind of think it loses its effect. Well, it loses its effect for me. Obviously, it doesn't for others. My lack of fondness for chanting is kind of a bit of blasphemy in this neo-pagan world we have of chants upon chants upon chants, so I'm probably an outlier when it comes to this. Drawing down the gods. This could be listed as both a similarity and a difference. It's a bit hard to explain. As priestess to my covens, the goddess moved through me and the god moved through the god. There's a shading of difference in that and what happens within the assembly. I could probably only adequately really explain the difference if I were trained in the ways of the assembly. The assembly calls what I consider drawing down aspecting. When I researched that, when I first learned the term through them, I realized other traditions do actually use the same word. It can be done in relation to any deity. I'm assuming, though, probably only deities that the person aspecting them is intimate with. I can't imagine a god would stop by just because you want to aspect them. I'm sure there is a deep, deep bond that leads up to this aspecting. And it's also by those who've been trained to do so. There's very specific training in the assembly for this. I've seen some awesome aspecting in assembly rituals. I've also seen aspecting during which I'm quite aware, and you kind of do like a sideways thing and goes, well, is this obvious to anybody else, that it's not aspecting, it's just, well, that person talking like they think that God would talk. I think perhaps that aspecting has the possibility of a co-presence of the one who's aspecting and the god or goddess they are aspecting. And at its best, it's extremely powerful. And there are shades of differences between it and drawing down. It might be those things, the shades of differences, that Well, it's taken some getting used to for me. And again, I'm not judging, but it's a different experience from my previous ones. I found that I'm more comfortable if I know I am listening to the words of the gods or the words of the one aspecting. Maybe I'm odd that it makes that much of a difference to me. I'm not denying I have my quirks. The god, let's put it this way, the god and the goddess. My former circles honored specific aspects of God and goddess, but mostly, especially honored the oneness of their 1,000 names. In my time with the assembly, I've seen working done more with specific deities, and not with the concept of deity that's more a part of my practices and my past covens. It's not off-putting, as whatever deity is called upon in a circle to me is both that deity in its specifics and its reality, and that deity as a face to the one goddess and the one God. Individuals and covens within the assembly might express this relationship in different ways, so please know I'm only referencing my own experience of assembly rituals I've attended. I sometimes lose a sense of who the gods are in the year at times in my assembly experience. Each Espit and Sabbat so distinct, with such specific deities popping up for each of them, and not necessarily the same deities when that same circumstance pops up again. I guess I haven't connected the dots between that. But that's okay, as my solo practices provide me with the flow that I need. Again, not judging, just saying, yep, it's a different kind of experience for me. There was a cohesive story from Samhain running through the end of the season of Mabon that was part of and is part of my private practices and in my circles past. I haven't yet built that with the way the assembly does rituals. I didn't appreciate my own need for a year-long story of the gods, of my gods, until this experience with the assembly. I'm up for a revolving cast of characters when it comes to the gods, but it's taken me some getting used to. Transparency. The assembly is transparent in almost everything. Rituals can almost always be shared with whomever. There are many opportunities to be involved in public activities that include non-assembly folk in them. And it's okay to speak about your experiences, except in the instances where something's meant to be a private working, privy to that experience and the people who were there. I do commend this, but it's very different from my past circles, which were mostly cloistered and private. I have a tiny story about how the difference this felt to me. I was at my first public ritual with the assembly, and there were a lot of people at it. And before the call to ritual, because we wear robes, I'll mention that in a bit, we all just disrobe and then robe. Well, I'm way cool with that. This girl's got no particular sense of over-modesty. Remember, the first decade I practiced skyclad, so you want to see my old lady underwear? Here it is. However, I had a little bit of a different experience the first time that I was doing this. First time in a group of people that I didn't know yet, except for my own coven mates who were part of this. But the vast majority, we're talking lots of people I didn't know. So, disrobing, and then fiddling with getting all dressed back again, and having a wonderful conversation with a couple of people around me. So after ritual, I'm talking to one of those people who I got to thinking doesn't really seem like he fits in. Nothing. It wasn't anything against him. There was nothing negative about him, but I thought, I don't think he fits. I don't think he's enjoying this. I think he feels uncomfortable. I don't know if we'll ever see him again. Ends up, it was his first experience of one of our rituals. So I'm getting undressed next to some dude literally from the streets that will probably never be back again. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but I'm saying that, well, that was a different experience for me. My personal tendencies lean toward privacy in practice. But my covens have not been a 501c organization, which has a responsibility to be transparent. A legal responsibility, no less what might be considered an ethical one. Plus, the assembly has a mission to teach and to be available to those seeking knowledge. Rituals are published to participants in advance, also different from my past experiences. We may have received from those of us who were coordinating the rituals a part we were going to be playing, a recitation, an action, a responsibility that was part for us in the upcoming ritual, but we didn't see the whole thing. We didn't experience the ritual before the ritual, if you know what I mean. So that's really different for me. Generally, I approve of this approach to being open and transparent. I would not hold this as being part of a circle I personally priestess to. I'd get back to my old ways of privacy, in all honesty, but it makes sense to me in light of who the assembly is and what their mission is. Okay, let's talk about money. Don't get me wrong on this. There's a lot to be offered within the assembly that is free or very inexpensive. But there are also events and rituals that involve payment. I'm not talking about payment to support, for instance, my own coven. I am more than willing to provide contributions towards its expenses and overhead. I work that into my family budget. I'm talking about funding at a higher level. Again, it's not a bad thing, it's a different thing. The assembly does amazing and in-depth work at sophisticated levels, requiring a lot of effort on behalf of a lot of people. But there's a structure to support, which means teaching sometimes comes at a price. I'm not judging, remember. I'm the witch who just started a Patreon account where folks can choose to pay for my teachings. With the assembly, though, this means I'm always going to be left out of a lot of activities as my finances are uber limited. That could be a bummer. It's different for me to feel excluded based on income. And let me say that one of the reasons the assembly has a financial structure is we also have the New Alexandrian Library, something unmatched, to my knowledge, anywhere in our pagan community. From its website describing the New Alexandrian Library, it's a research and lending library dedicated to the preservation of books, periodicals, newsletters, music, media, artworks, artifacts, photographs, and digital media focused on the metaphysical aspects of all religions and traditions. There's a special focus on the preservation of materials from the pagan, polytheistic, and Western mystery traditions. This is not a theoretical library, folks. This is a brick and mortar building. I have no words powerful enough to honor the work that's being done there and will continue to be done there in service of our greater community. Cakes, and by that I mean cakes and wine, cakes and ale, cakes and whatever. It's not a standard part of assembly rituals, although they are put to good effect when a ritual can use their energy. In my past circles, they were a must, and they were the center of circle even when workings were done. They were the hub and the turning point and the reason, the celebration for our rituals. Sabbats. There's a difference in ritual flavoring in the assembly rituals I have experienced, where it's more an exploration of magic and personal growth than having a first priority of honoring the gods. Didn't say the gods aren't honored. I mentioned first priority of honoring the gods. You have to understand, this comes from a witch who has a personal practice, aligned to my history with all my prior covens, that the only purpose of a sabbat is to honor the gods. Period. End of story. Espats are for workings. Non-espat and non-sabbat calls to ritual are for workings. But sabbats are for the gods only. This is an area where I don't know if the folks in the assembly would agree or not, and every coven probably has its own way. I suppose the best way to put it is that there is an agenda for sabbat rituals that seems wider, in a sense, than my experience of them and need for them, or even perhaps what my personal gods demand of them. This is an interesting one. It's only interesting in light of this being a specific Wiccan tradition. There's no specific plan of education and training. I don't mean that each individual coven doesn't have its own plan, but there isn't one set in stone across the board. it would be very helpful for me as a newbie at the beginning and even a year later if there were a plan that I followed that was similar to or identical to that which everybody else followed when they were newbies and in their first year. There's definitely certain things taught in common throughout the assembly, but I come from circles and covens where the same plan was followed by all. It would have been especially helpful to me in learning the similarities and differences between my past circles, my personal practice, and assembly practices. Maybe that's because I'm all about learning, and being at one with my new group's energy, focus, and practice. Working robed. As with just about everything I've shared, this really is not important. It's just a noted difference and an adjustment I needed to make. I don't happen to like working robed. I feel weighted down and I feel less free in a robe. While I'm proud to wear my white robe and turquoise tabard for assembly ritual, and I gotta say, the first time I was dressed in them, I cried. It's just not my preference. Is that another quirk of mine? Ending of circle. I really only encountered two things which appear vastly different from my experience. In most assembly rituals, when taking down the circle, it is earthed. Not completely dispersed as it is and always has been in my practice and in my former circles, but offered to the ground so that some part of its energy remains. Of course, this would not be the case if certain workings were meant to leave no trace, but usually the closing of circle in the assembly is more along the lines of earthing. I can't tell you how specific this is in practice or how it feels to me. I'm especially energy sensitive to the creation and the dissolution of circles. In assembly rituals, you feel the closing of the circle more along the lines of an earthing. You feel it settle down around you rather than feeling it like dispersed to the four quarters, which is how I might experience it in my own circles and ones I've led and participated in the past. For me, no circle is ever to be left as a trace of energy in the physical. There will be a tracing in the ether, but not in the here and now. I speak from limited knowledge on this perspective, not having experienced it often enough to appreciate the wisdom of assembly practices in this regard. It's also the practice in some covens and with some practitioners within the assembly to dismiss the watchtowers with "go if you will, stay if you must." Well, that might be aligned to the same wisdom as the way circles are sometimes grounded and remain energetically present afterwards. It's not my thing in the way I do things outside of those circles. I thank my guardians and wish them good travels after my rituals, but the intent is that they leave for their world as I leave to return to mine. This is the one area where the difference, the shading, seems somehow really more important to me. This what remains after the dissolution of circle. It's an area I need to learn more about from the assembly perspective. I'm okay being in circle when this is done because truthfully, since I'm not priestess or priest of that circle, what happens once the circle comes down is not my responsibility. Whatever the reason for this to me, this different way of doing things, it's owned by those who own the circle. I do know that for me, I have on occasion felt a confusion of energy, especially at the start of circles within the assembly. It's like the bits and pieces of old rituals and workings are kind of moving over to make room for the new one. Maybe I'm just hypersensitive in this regard, just because it's something different for me. Regularity of ritual. I come from a school of every espet, full and dark, and sabbat happening without fail, with no exceptions, ever. My need for that is personal and abiding. It has to do with what I feel any coven owes its gods and each other. Some covens within the assembly, I'm sure, adhere to my kind of schedule. Others are more casual. Again, I'm not judging. I think you get that by now, folks. I'm talking about loved ones. I'm talking about people who live in my heart, as do the work that they do. Some might say I'm old school. Some would say that the honoring and circle of every point on the wheel is appropriate and time critical. But hey, Even in my personal rituals, I adhere to a schedule. That's me. And one last thing. This might be, you might think this is huge, but it's not. I have the tarot to thank for that. Within the assembly of the sacred wheel, wand is fire and blade is air. I'm aligned to them. Blade is fire and wand is air. It's okay though, as it's clear why the assembly honors them as they do. Those teachings were very clear to me. I just have to remember when with assembly folks that my own practice differs and not to confuse myself in the process. It's not like this big challenge for me, as I've had to honor that in tarot for all these years. I've studied that. So while it might seem a big difference, it's really not a big difference for me. Everything I've said, they're just shadings of differences, and this witch is comfortable with them. If I was not comfortable, I wouldn't be a member of the assembly. This was a hard video to do. I hope I've been open enough to satisfy my viewer's question. The challenge was to share perceived differences from someone in their first year who is not an initiate, with no disrespect, to an amazing, powerful, magical group of individuals and covens. The people I've met, from individuals to priests and priestesses to elders, are deserving of my love and my respect. And that is what I hold for them. They've opened me to new possibilities. Kabbalah, for instance, and new ways of doing things. They've taught an old witch some new tricks, and they have respected her eccentricities. I've got plenty of them. What more can you ask for? That plus really, really good potlucks. It's just been a year in this particular journey for me. I'm not the know-all representative of the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. I am sharing my first-year impressions with you all. I'll learn more whys and wherefores as I go forward, and I personally plan on revisiting this blog in Lammas of 2020 to see where I have developed greater understanding of and deeper participation in these ways, which at the same time seem familiar and different. I can share with absolute conviction to those wanting to be in ritual with others that your search does not have to be for the perfect fit. What matters is if the bones of the practice align to your ethics and beliefs. All practices will have their own layering on top of that. A seeker explores to understand the underlying logic and power which drives a circle. That's where they make their greatest connection. We can come to respect the layering over the foundation of rituals when we understand what drives them. We might even find something new to consider and explore, and we can be one with others who might not be our clones. I think that's one of the great beauties of the assembly. There's so many practitioners to inspire you in so many different ways. I would encourage anyone in the Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey area in search of a wider pagan community and a place to be with others to learn and grow, to consider attending a public assembly ritual to see what it's like. Individual covens do open some of their rituals to the public as an outreach. You can find information on open classes and events for the assembly on their website, sacredwheel.org, and you can click on the various covens listed there to see what they might be offering to the public. And you can also find the assembly on their public Facebook page, listed as Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. First and foremost, my heart and my passion is engaged with these beautiful people. I have had nothing but positive experiences, even if maybe some left me confused or gave me new things to ponder. And I'm not an initiate. I have spent 1 year with the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. It's been a mind-opening, heart-opening, soul-opening year. And I'm looking forward to see what happens going forward. But keep in mind, this is the perspective of someone who is in their year and a day with the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel. You might say I'm sharing first impressions. And if you're thinking of looking into a group, check out my mini list of these topics that I've explored to see where my fit is. And in my case, I've found that even if not exactly what I'm looking for, There's a powerful fit in almost every way. I wish those of you who are seeking good luck on your journey to find others, and I encourage you to consider finding others who inspire you, not insisting they be just like you. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Merry part.